Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining and welcome to this Learn Live session where we'll be covering the tools, processes and approaches that you can use to help migrate your servers to Azure quickly, securely and efficiently. My name is Barney Gwither and I'm an engineer in the Fast Track for Azure team based here in the UK. I work with most things Azure infrastructure related and have a particular focus on migrations. Hosting today's session with me is my colleague Srini. Srini, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Barney. Hi, everyone. I am Srini Tumala. I'm a senior customer engineer in FastTrack Microsoft team, and I do work in the US region, where Barney is in the UK region. We do almost the same thing, but in different geographies. That's our small introduction. Back to you, Barney.
Brilliant. Thank you, Srini. Srini and I aren't alone. We have two of our wonderful colleagues, Saul and Becky, who are acting as moderators in the chat. So as we're busy presenting, if you have any questions or concerns or observations about what we're discussing, feel free to use the chat down below somewhere to fire any questions you have to our team. Becky and Saul will be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Don't forget to say hello to Becky and Saul as well, and I'm sure Becky and Saul will say hello so you can see them in the chat and understand who they are. As we progress today, we'll probably share quite a few links throughout the session. We've managed to capture all of those links and several other what we think are useful resources. We've put them in a collection. You can get to that collection by visiting the link that's on screen now or by scanning the QR code. Don't worry if you don't get that link now. We'll share this screen again towards the end of the presentation, so you can grab those links later on as well. Great. So let's start by thinking about what we're going to try and cover today. We've got, at a high level, 3 topics that we want to look at. So we'll start by looking at your environment in Azure. So it's great for us to put together all this content talking about how we can migrate servers to Azure, but we need to also think about where we're migrating those servers to. Azure isn't just a bucket that you can throw servers at. We need to do a little bit of work to prepare the ground to host those workloads once we migrate them. Once we've done that, we'll move on to talk about how Azure Migrate actually does that work of copying your data from your existing environment into Azure, a process that we call replication. When we have replication sorted and we understand how that works and have it configured and up and running, we can then turn our attention to thinking about the actual migration process. So once we've got that data replicating, what other steps can we do before we do the migration to give us full confidence that migration will work, and then the actual migration process itself. It's quite a lot to cover, but we've got 90 minutes, and I think we can fit it all in. Just to return quickly, because this is part 2 of 2. So previously, we had another session, which I'm sure there's a link to somewhere near this video. But in the first session, we covered a couple of topics that we will assume are sort of prerequisites to this. So we first of all talked about the process of discovery. So this is when you could download an appliance that we call, there's a link in the chat to part 1 hopefully as well. So you can download your appliance that we provide, and you can use that to discover your existing environment. So gather an up-to-date inventory of your server estate, start to understand what processes and software might be installed on those servers, understand how those servers communicate with one another, and understand also the utilization of resources on those servers. So that's that discovery piece where we can gather information about your environment. Once we've gathered that information, we can then create reports and assessments based on that data. These can help us to understand whether the servers that you have on premises today are compatible with Azure. Does it make sense to try and move them to Azure? It can also help us to understand, if we do move them to Azure, what size servers we should create in Azure to host those workloads. Based off the back of that information, we can then start to give you some cost estimates for what it might cost to then run those workloads in Azure. Building on top of that again, we have some relatively new functionality around business cases. That's a piece of functionality we can use to look at the projected cost of running your workloads on premises and compare that to what it might cost to continue to run them in your existing environment. So that's what we covered last time in a nutshell. For today's session, though, we'll be covering these two additional topics. So we'll be talking about this concept of replication, copying that data from your existing environment to Azure. And then we'll also talk about the process of once we've got that data in Azure, how do we do the cutover? How do we switch from operating on premises to this new set of data that's in Azure? As I mentioned at the start, though, before we start throwing servers into Azure, we need to have an environment that can host them. We need something to run these servers in. A bit like if you went out and bought some new physical servers to host your environment on premises, you would need a server room or a data center to run them in. You could almost think of that similar kind of concept in Azure. You've got the Azure virtual machines, the data that makes up those servers. We need to connect those to networks. We need to organize those pieces of those resources. We need to join them all together. We need to make sure they're secure. They have the correct governance processes in place. How do we think about doing that? That's something that you could do yourselves from scratch. But in our experience, or using our experience across hundreds, thousands of successful migration projects, we have lots of guidance that we can provide you with. So we talked previously about the cloud adoption framework. Part of that is a concept that we call Azure landing zones. And that really encapsulates all of that thinking around the processes that you can follow and good practices you can use to create that environment in Azure that will host your workloads. What I really like about Azure landing zones is not just that it's this great prescriptive guidance that says, you need to secure your workloads. Microsoft Defender for Cloud is a good way to do that. That's super helpful. Having that guidance on what tools and technologies you could use is really helpful. More than that, though, is that the Azure landing zone concept provides a whole set of sample implementations. So if you're starting entirely from scratch, you have no infrastructure in Azure today, that can be intimidating. You've just got a blank piece of paper, a blank portal, and you would have to go and think about all these different design areas, governance, security, networking, identity, and many more. Azure landing zones give you these sample implementations that will, at the click of a button and the provisioning of a few parameters, or with some infrastructure as code if you prefer, can deploy that set of infrastructure that will help meet those requirements for you. So yeah, this is a fantastic resource, something that I highly recommend. Not everybody is coming to Azure with a greenfield environment. So it's not like you're starting from scratch. Lots of customers we work with already have some infrastructure in Azure. Maybe that was created relatively recently. Maybe it's something that's been around for a while, and maybe you might have some concerns about whether it follows all of the best practices that we recommend. That can be a challenge. So a nice thing that you can do is using, again, another resource that we're providing here that we call our review checklists. So this is an Excel spreadsheet that you can download. It's up to date with all of the lots of good practices that we recommend for your landing zone. And you can work through that spreadsheet, comparing your implementation with our good practices and determine whether there are any obvious gaps or things that you could reconcile to improve the quality of your existing landing zone. So again, we have a solution for if you're starting from scratch, brand new. We have these sample reference implementations you could use. If you already have a deployment, we have this solution of a landing zone review where you can compare your implementation to good practices and improve it if you can to get it into tip-top condition. Srini, I'm sure that you've come across and used these concepts of landing zones before. Do you have any more input on these?
Yeah, one or two things to add is When this is the landing zone is the basic foundation before even thinking about like doing a migration. I've seen use cases where customers are trying to directly jump into the migration. Let's migrate, right? So that is sometimes I've seen in certain use cases where customers directly want to migrate as the first step. That is not what is the best practice. That is what we are talking about: this landing zone design, landing zone review checklist, etc. Irrespective of the fact whether the customer is a greenfield customer or they have already have some workloads and trying to migrate them, right? It's always important to go back, look at the existing, what I would say is the infrastructure, and make sure we are following all best practices, and then think about like migrating newer workloads into Azure. Because let's say, for example, if you have fewer workloads and you're moving tons and tons of workloads, then the whole scenario will change with respect to the design what you have already designed if you are not a greenfield customer. So that's something to consider before migrating.
Absolutely. You have to admire the enthusiasm of people who just want to rush and get their services in Azure right away. But yeah, we have to do the hard yards beforehand, and make sure we've got a good environment to host those workloads. That's absolutely where this concept of landing zones and landing zone reviews kicks in. So Shrini, let's assume that we've gone ahead and we've deployed a new landing zone following all the best practices. We did all the work we discussed last time around discovering our existing environment, assessing it. We've determined that yes, Azure is right for us. We've identified that first set of servers that we want to migrate to Azure. The next thing we do is replication, right? I think you were going to start to talk to us and show us what that concept and how that works in practice as well.
Yeah. So yeah, the next obvious step. Thanks, Barney, for the background. So yeah, the next step is the replication, and for replication, there is few things that we have to do to make sure we have the like the infrastructure in place for doing the replication. What First, let's look at what are the requirements we have for replication, and the first step is to use the Azure Migrate appliance or using replication provider, depending on the source environment. Right? The source environment can be VMware, it can be Hyper-V, it can be physical servers, it can be other cloud providers. Depending on the source environment, the requirement will change with respect to how you're replicating your source environment to Azure. And what are we replicating? We can replicate Windows and Linux servers. And the Azure Migrate service that is in Azure will do all the orchestration when it comes to taking an image of your source environment, copying that into Azure, and whenever you're doing like a test deployment for testing this application in Azure, that orchestration is done by Azure Migrate appliance, and also the cutover also is done by Azure Migrate appliance. And this is a common question, like what is like the data loss look like? What does the downtime look like? You can make sure if you plan this out correctly, there will be zero data loss, meaning you will be shutting down the source machine, taking a final data replication of your machine that is migrating to Azure, and to make sure there is zero data loss. And also there will be some minimal downtime because we are shutting down the source machine and then bringing a new machine in Azure, which means there is a minimal downtime. The downtime has to be planned accordingly. So let's look at some of the architectures we have for different infrastructure or the source environment we're talking about, right? This is a VMware architecture. In the case of VMware, we have this Azure Migrate appliance, which is talking to the Hyper-V environment that is in your data center. And in the case of the Hyper-V, there are two options that will be presented for you to when you're deploying this appliance in the source environment. When I say two options is because how many source machines, how many VMs are you trying to migrate from the source environment to Azure is where that like question mark comes into picture. If you are looking for only like less than like 100 machines or something that you're migrating to Azure, then there is only one appliance that is required for the whole replication process for transferring all this disk images. This is a block level replication. To be specific, the technologies that are used is like VMware change block tracking, and it's VMware snapshots that happens on the source environment that gets replicated to the Azure environment. On the Azure side, you can see the storage account, the services that are required for this particular Azure Migrate service, right? So there will be storage account, service bus, key vault, and recovery services vault. All those services get automatically deployed when we create this Azure Migrate project and enable trying to enable replication. That's when these services get created. And then if you're trying to, then that is where the next architecture comes into picture when you're trying to do at scale. Like I have 500 like VMs that I have to migrate, or 1,000 VMs that I have to migrate, and how do I uh, plan this out, and how do I scale this out? That is where the scale out architecture comes into picture. So in general, this appliance has two components in it. One is the process server, and the second one is the configuration server. They both are in the same Azure Migrate appliance to start with when it is at a smaller scale, and they can be split apart. Like the process server will generally talk to the your source environment, which is in this case VMware. It will take all the like snapshots, all those things, and the configuration server will transfer all the data to Azure. That is where these two services come into picture inside the appliance. And when it comes to scale-out architecture, those roles get split up apart, and we can have like how many our virtual machine. I mean, which is the when I'm talking about virtual machine, I'm talking about the appliance here. How many our appliance we need based on our requirement. There's a document in place where we talk about like for for the server configuration, like for example, a 16 core 32 gig memory appliance, how many parallel replication that it can do. And and if you're doing an 8 core, there's a number of server requirements. Likewise, you will be planning this out for replication for VMware at scale. And it's the same architecture like you saw last on the last slide. The only difference is there will be more of this Azure Migrate appliances will be running on your source environment for this replication to happen at scale. And let's look at Hyper-V architecture, right? So Hyper-V technology works differently. Even though the replication technology that is happening in the background is a little different, but however, on the front end, which if you're looking at the portal, it will all look the same when it comes to the how you are seeing the machines getting replicated, and also doing the testing, cutover. All those things are the same. It's the background technology that is used for replication is different. In the case of Hyper-V, we are using a Hyper-V replication provider that is installed on the Hyper-V host. Let's say if I have 10 different hosts for this Hyper-V environment, I'll be installing this replication provider on 10 different hosts. That will orchestrate the replication from the source environment to Azure. Bunny, I talked a lot. Do you want to add something here before we move on to the physical case? So
Yeah, no. So just one thing for any of the Hyper-V admins out there. I really like when we deploy the Hyper-V scenario, because when you're looking at the Hyper-V manager, if you're used to seeing when your Hyper-V VMs are being replicated between servers in your on-premises environment, once we have this configured, it's really interesting because you can see when a virtual machine running on Hyper-V has been configured to replicate to Azure, you see the same thing. So instead of seeing that virtual machine being replicated between one Hyper-V host and another, you can see it being replicated, but the target is Azure. So I don't know. I always think that's really cool that the integration is that tight that we see that yeah, like I say, Azure as one of the destinations for replication. I think it's really slick. So yeah, it's very
yeah,
nifty.
yeah, that's an important point. Like Bonnie mentioned, even though the underlying technology is different, I can create a single project, have multiple appliances in that single migration project. And only difference would be when it comes to replication, I will be jumping into the replication demo. All the things that getting replicated will look the same unless and until you go to the settings and look at our appliances. Then it will show you, okay, these machines are coming from this appliance and these machines are coming from this appliance, meaning Hyper-V appliance as well as VMware appliance. So this is the high level technology, and the last architecture is based for physicals and other cloud providers. How do we replicate how the replication architecture works? In that case, we are designating a server that will do the replication for us. That will be a replication appliance, and which will have this configuration server and the process server that is running on them. I talked about this earlier, right? So the same concept as like VMware, but this will have an agent. It's an agent-based architecture because this mobility service will be installed on each and every physical machine you are trying to migrate, or on the VMs that are running in other cloud providers. This mobility service will be installed on the machines you're trying to migrate. So this is like a two-step process. You'll be setting the appliance, you'll be deploying the mobility service, and those two combination together will help you replicate that servers to Azure. And with respect to the components that is required in Azure in this use case, is there's a storage account, the recovery services vault. Those are the services that will be involved in the migration orchestration. And with that being said, right, so what are we supporting, right? So with respect to the support for the VMs in Azure, we do support most of the Linux 64-bit distributions. We do support Windows 8 as well. Even though this is end of life, end of support, we give customers an option to still run these workloads in Azure before they can make sure they are kind of decommissioning it or moving this application to a different operating system. Barney, since we talked about 2008, have you seen customers try still on 2008?
Oh, worse than that, Trini. I've seen customers running server 2003 who are still clinging on. And yeah, there are some, like, please don't do it, but there are, if you have to, there are some scenarios where even server 2003 can be migrated to Azure, but it's dreadful. Please don't. The time has come. Take those servers out behind the shed and thank them for their work, and reinstall their workloads on a modern operating system, please.
Yeah, it's important that we keep the environment up to date. But this is an edge case scenario where customers are clinging on to this operating systems because of the fact that there is some issue that they cannot migrate. Maybe the application can't install in a newer operating system, or there are some edge use cases where they cannot. But it's time for us to rethink how we use that application, maybe switching on to a different application. All those use cases are there to mitigate the situation. And also when it comes to the source environment, we talked about this right earlier. So install a replication appliance for VMware. That is the requirement in the source environment for replication provider on Hyper-V host for the Hyper-V environment, and also mobility service agent, and also the appliance for the physical and other cloud providers. So this is like a high-level requirements when it comes to source environment, and also what are the supported virtual machines. Having said that, let's jump into the demo. So I've already logged into my Azure portal here, and to get into the Azure Migrate, you can simply type in Azure Migrate. That will get to this. That let you to get into this Azure Migrate service, and you can click on servers, databases, and web applications. And this is the screen that will be presented. So in the last session, right, in the session 1, like 2 days back, we showed you how to create a project, how to discover your workloads on the source in the source environment. How do we build a business case? How do we do that dependency analysis? How do we do assessment? All those things in general. Like, let me go back to the overview here. we saw how do we discover all these servers, right, in the source environment. So for time constraint, we are not going to do this like the discovery and analysis, assessment, all those dependency analysis again, but we are just covering like what we did in the last session. And for this session, we are going to focus on the second section like this. The first section is these assessment tools, and the second section is the migration tools. We are going to cover this today. First thing first is if you have already deployed an migration appliance, right? In the case of VMware, which can be used for the replication as well. So I have several projects in my demo environment. I have VMware, I have Hyper-V, I have one use case where I have a physical server. But for this demo, we are going to focus on the VMware and see how we can do the replication and what are the options in replication and how do we do testing, how do we do cutover, all those things we'll be covering in today. First is the discover here is about discovering the appliance for migration or replication. I will be selecting my virtualization, which is VMware in this case. And it is going to ask for two options, whether you want to do an agentless option for replication or agent-based. Yeah, so these are two options that are presented to us because in a case where there will be an agent-based replication option that is presented to our customers because of the use case where there are certain you don't have the access to the environment, or you want to use the agent base for more deeper discovery and things like that. That is where we use the agent based recovery. Otherwise we can do an agentless option, and this is something you'll be deploying like a new appliance. This is as if like this is the same appliance that we deployed for the discovery. But in this case, I have already deployed this appliance earlier. So if that is the case, what I do, I go to the replicate option here, and I select like what do you want to migrate. I want to migrate servers or virtual machines, correct? That is my use case. And where do you want to migrate it to? That is the Azure virtual machine. I am moving this source machine which is a virtual machine into Azure virtual machine, which is an infrastructure. Like it is basically the lift and shift approach or rehosting. So what next, right? I click on continue, and it will ask me for the type of virtualization. I'm selecting VMware as an example, and it's going to ask me the on-prem appliance. I've already created the appliance from our last session, and I'm selecting that appliance as VMware Migrate, and I'm selecting Next. And then here, there's an option that is presented to us whether we would like to use the assessment or not. Why do we need this option is, if you select the option as yes, so I will be when I'm doing the deployment of my virtual machine in Azure, the assessment information is considered for right sizing. I will show you that in the next screen now after I complete this step, right? I'm selecting an existing group that I created for assessment, and I'm selecting the assessment for the servers, and I'm selecting, let's say I'm going to select one server for replication. And these are options that you have to make sure you understand these options. But before going to the next step is, first I'm selecting the subscription where I'm going to replicate this workload. I'm selecting my subscription. I'm selecting an resource group. And once I selected the resource group, the key options here is to understand where your workloads are going to be deployed, right? Whenever you're doing the cutover, this workloads will be deployed in a virtual network. And that is the virtual network I'm selecting, and also the subnet that this particular workload gets deployed to. And if you have any availability options, such as the availability zone or availability set, you can select that. And next is the disencryption. If you have any disencryption requirement, please select that. And this is also very important, which is the test migration. So why do we select two different like VNets and subnets here because of the requirement. We have to keep in mind that whenever I'm doing a test migration, I am testing this server, and I'm also, if you have a connectivity between Azure to your on-prem environment, and that will create an issue where, for example, I have a Windows machine running on the source environment. It's already up and running. It's a production server, and I'm trying to bring in another server into the mix. And if these two talk to the Active Directory controller at the same time, then it's a problem, right? So now two machines are with the same name talking to the domain controller. That is where we have to do this testing at an isolated fashion. For that reason, I'm selecting a virtual network, a separate virtual network and separate subnet in this example. And Bunny, I just wanted to make sure I have covered everything. You want to chip in anything here?
No, I think it's really good to make clear that the fact that we did that work previously, where we discovered the on-premises environment, we gathered all that data, we used that to perform an assessment. Part of the outcome of that assessment was the recommendations on how you could size those machines. So not deploying a machine that's going to be sat there not really doing much most of the time, because you're going to be paying extra for that. The right sizing assessment make sure that the machine that gets deployed has got enough RAM and CPU, but not too much. And that data is what you showed here. That gets pulled through into these settings. So yeah, I think that's an important thing for customers to be aware of, that they can get that insight from the data they spent all that time collecting. So, but yeah, no, otherwise this is great, isn't it? So sort of this flow makes sense. It's all quite logical, I think.
Yeah, also a couple of options here is to, if you have a Windows Server license, you can select this so you can, so the hybrid benefits applied. And also, if you're having to register the SQL Server as an extension, infrastructure as service extension, you can select that as an option. And let's go next and figure out like what are the other options, right? So this is where I was talking about assessment makes sense here. If you look at the source machine, this is the name of the server I'm going to replicate to, and this is the name of the Windows VM that will be in Azure, and this is the capacity of that machine running in source environment in VMware. It is 2 cores and 4 gig memory. And what are this is where you see the difference here, right? This is what assessment will do for you. Assessment is coming now and telling us that this, based on our utilization, which we have done maybe for 1 week or 2 weeks or even for a month, the recommendation is a standard F1, which has got only 1 core and 2 gig memory. And this is because of the fact that, like Barney mentioned earlier, this consumption, you're going to pay for what you're consuming. And we are recommending lesser size because of the utilization we found out on the server in the source environment. And let's go next. Yeah, I purposefully selected this machine to show this error message. So this is this Windows 2012 standard is a naming convention, or it's a trademark name that which Microsoft has, and you cannot be using this name as a virtual machine in Azure. So there are certain names are mentioned as trademark names, and you shouldn't be using those names as the names. So this is very critical in understanding what names you're choosing in Azure. And Bunny, have you seen such issues while migrating? So
This one is entirely new to me. I thought I knew everything about migrations, but you've surprised me here, Srini. Yeah, I haven't come across it before. That's
yes, there are
that's
certain
super
names.
interesting. Yeah,
There are certain names. There are certain usernames you shouldn't be using in Azure, which are being either trademarked or being. Uh, so those are the names you shouldn't be using. And in this case, also to mention, this is the virtual machine name, what you see in the portal. Correct, Bunny? So this is not
exactly.
the
Yeah.
virtual. This is not the name of the what is inside the operating system. There is the name that you see in the portal. There will be a name inside the operating system, and sometimes they can be the same. They can be different as well. It depends, right? It's the same as VMware. If you can go and rename a virtual machine as a different name compared to what the name is in the operating system. This the same applies here too. And so I have in this use case, I can say like I'm going to give some name as like app server. And one more thing I want to mention is, right, so this is a recommendation, right? If you want to change the name to change this capacity to a different one, you can change that as well. Yeah, the source, I want to keep this as source, right? Yeah, it is fine. You can also go and select here like a different capacity here and go next as well. So that is also possible. And the next option is the disk. Here is that recommendation, right? So this disk to replicate, I have only one disk that is attached to this Windows 2012 standard machine that is in VMware, and the size of this is 40 gigs, and the recommendation is standard hard disk. And if you have any specific requirements with respect to the disk IOPS, you can go and change it to standard SSD or a premium SSD. What is the difference is going to be the cost. Depending on the disk type you're choosing, the cost varies. So that is something to keep in mind. And the next option is other tags. If you should be having some tagging requirements, putting in like the department name, the cost center, etc. So you should be putting in the tags at some point. And going next. And the final step is I can review all this information that I provided and click on replicate. And what happens next is this machine will, there is a job that runs in the background. I will show you shortly. So this is the different jobs that are running in the background. Either, for example, I clicked on start replication. That's currently it's run a prereq and said successful. And next is it will be enabling the migration. And it starts replication, and the fourth step is to do a continuous replication, right? When we click on this, right, so the important thing that keep in mind is this is a block level replication, and it's irrelevant what the application is running on it. It can run, you can have a SQL server running on it. You can have an application server. You can have a IaaS running on it, or any application on running inside the operating system will be replicated, since it's a block level application that's being transferred to Azure. That is the initial replication. And once the initial replication is complete, the next step is delta replication that happens. Let's go and look at our console, right? I'm going into the project now. This is how my our dashboard will look like. So it shows like 3 different steps here. The first step is replicate, which we saw. And then second step is the migration, the test migration. And that third step is the actual migration or the cutover. And if I click on replicating machines, and this is the machine that I just initiated a replication. I initiated a replication for another machine like just before this meeting. I wanted to show you this. That is why I did this. So if you look at here, the initial replication for this web server is at 56%, meaning 56% the disk. It took a disk copy, and out of the disk copy, like 56% has been transferred to Azure, and rest of the 44% has to happen for the initial replication to complete. Once that initial replication is complete, the next subsequent images are going to be a delta sync, what you are seeing here, which is a delta sync, the replication status. And also, you can see the name of the server, the type of replication status, the health of this replication, and the last thing that happened for this particular server, which is this morning, early morning. And whether the test migration status is complete or pending, you can see that. And migration status, it says ready to migrate. So this is like the high-level steps on what you can see with respect to once you enable the replication. Anything else to add to this, Barney?
So I've got a question. I'm surprised this hasn't come up in the chat yet, and it's a loaded question, Srini. How long does replication take?
Good question. There's no easy answer.
Exactly. That's why it's kind of loaded, isn't it? It is something that comes up, though.
Yeah.
So we should probably try to address it as best we can.
Yeah. So the reason why I said this is not an easy answer is because it depends on the size of the server, right? In my example, I had only one disk. I've seen even like 10 disks, 20 disks for customers. And depending on the size of your source server, the replication time may take few hours. It may take even days. Uh, how do you determine like what will be my bandwidth and how long does it take? We have something called as a I'm just zooming this. This is the capacity planner you can deploy and figure out like what will be the bandwidth requirement that is required for the migration. Sorry, for the replication. And that's a very good tool to use for understanding your capacity. That's a very good question. It was for understanding the overall timeline, right? And also that is also very important to make sure how long to understand how long does the delta replication takes place as well, right? So this is the initial replication takes longer, but the delta replication will be very smaller. But again, the size of the data and also the disk churn is very important. If it's a server that is like a SQL server where it's constantly like being written into, then there is a lot of churn happening in the source environment. Depending on the churn, there will be a lot more data that gets transferred as a delta replication. If there is no churn, the delta replication time will be less. Anything? Are you okay with that response, Bunny?
I think you nailed it. You're exactly right. There are those two dimensions, aren't there? So the time it takes depends on the size of what you're replicating and also how much bandwidth is available. I think something that I try to make clear to customers is when you hit replicate, Azure Migrate is going to throw as much data as fast as it can down your internet pipe, your internet connection to Azure to get that replication, that initial replication done as quick as possible.
Right.
So something some customers are concerned about is that they've got one internet connection, and that might be being used for normal business as usual operations. Maybe they host a website on it or something. When they enable replication, Azure Migrate will try and use all of that bandwidth. So again, that's something that they can control with
Yeah.
some of our throttling functionality, right? Depending on the solution they're using, the scenario they're in. That's something I think that's worth kind of thinking about from their perspectives as well.
Yeah, that is very important. So if you have any bandwidth requirements and if you have bandwidth requirements and you're concerned about the bandwidth that is being utilized for this migration transfer, you can use the throttling. We have settings that you can go and set in the appliance with respect to VMware, Hyper-V. So to make sure we don't that appliance don't exceed that specific setting, right? So that is something important to understand. Yeah. And the next step is actually so once I'm done with my replication, what do I do? Right? It's the testing. So we would like to before we jump into the demo, right? We would like to cover some high-level topics on how do we do the testing. Bunny, do you want to talk about like the testing with few slides?
Absolutely, yes, yes. Testing obviously super important. We we don't want to go into the migration itself without having some confidence that it's going to work. So I've got a slide here that talks a little bit about what this high level process looks like. So we've talked about previously to this session, we've talked about the discovery and assessment. Srini's just walked through what that replication process looks like. So how we go about enabling replication, that initial replication for each server completes. The servers are then in that delta synchronization state. So they're continuously sending any changes that happen on premises or in your existing environment up to that copy of the data we have in Azure. So you might think, great, we've got a copy of our data in Azure. We can just hit the button and migrate. And you can, and some customers do. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that makes sense to go ahead and do that. What we would more likely expect or recommend is that you can use this alternative feature that Trini's already alluded to around test migrations. So we have a little bit of information about how this process works and what it is. And really what it's doing is we're maintaining this copy of your data in Azure, ready for when you do the cutover, when you hit migrate, we can use that data to create your new production server. We shut down the one on premises and go over and use the new one that we've created. Before we go ahead and do that, though, this test migration feature allows us to take a copy. This is getting confusing now. We can take a copy of the copy of your server in Azure. So the data that we've been synchronizing, we can take a copy of that and create another virtual machine. So nothing happens to production. Your production machine that's still in your original environment continues to run as normal. That ongoing replication process, that also continues. That's not interrupted. All we're doing is grabbing a copy of that data that's in Azure and using that to create another instance of the same machine. And then, Srini, it's great that you called this out. It's super important that we think about if we do this test migration, it's going to create another copy, a duplicate of your production workload. And I don't know, I think about Ghostbusters and when they talk about crossing the streams, New Testament stuff, you really, really don't want. I've done it before in the past, restored a server from backup and accidentally connected it to the production network, and boom, I've got two instances of the same machine. Azure directory gets confused. Anything that's trying to use DNS to find that machine is going to get awfully confused. So we call that out as super important here, to have a separate, isolated, sometimes people call it like a sandbox environment, that if we do this test migration, that's where we create and connect that test copy of the machine. It's nothing to do with production. So you can't have this Ghostbusters stream crossing problem. So yeah, that's a super important to think about. What can we do with that though? So that test migration, we go ahead and create a copy of your existing machine in this isolated environment in Azure. What what does that really give us? So there's a few things really. We can, the most simple thing is, does the machine boot in Azure? Even if the assessment that we've conducted says, yep, this machine's compatible, it's all going to be good. It's nice to have the reassurance that you've seen that happen. You've created a copy of that machine as you would when you do migration, and the machine has booted. You can see that it's got to the login screen, it's ready to go. In addition to that, and I've found this helpful, sometimes the firewall that's configured on the Windows firewall on the server that you've copied to Azure, maybe that's not configured to allow RDP connections. So, how are you going to log in and administer it? So again, that's something that you can verify through this test migration process. Perhaps RDP isn't even enabled. Maybe it was a server that you're used to going to in your server room and manually sitting at and logging in. So again, doing this test migration can give you some of that confidence that these sorts of things are going to work post-migration. What it is harder to do is it probably isn't a perfect solution for giving you that whole end-to-end testing. So maybe the workload you're looking to migrate is made up of half a dozen servers, some web servers, app servers, and database servers. You could do a test migration of each of those servers into that sandbox environment and verify that they can all communicate. Services start correctly, the web tier can talk to the app tier, any configuration changes you need to make, IP changes in the database connection strings, those types of things, you can test those. But you have to remember that it won't be connected to your production environment. So a sort of shortcoming that I see as part of that is that lots of workloads would depend on things like Active Directory. And again, we've talked about this sandbox environment, this isolated environment. It's not production. It's unlikely, it's difficult to have a domain controller in there. So again, just be aware that this test migration feature is great for doing some of that simple, does the machine boot? Is it accessible? Can I log into it? Have some services started? Brilliant for that. It may not be perfect for doing that entire end-to-end. Does the application run? Can users authenticate? Those sorts of things may not be as easy to test, but it will give you that initial confidence that the machine will boot and be accessible. Is that sort of similar to your experience, Srini?
Yeah, that is true. Matter of fact, I'm working with a customer this week doing the same thing. So the customer is trying to deploy the recommendation was to deploy separate VNets like what we talked about earlier in the demo. Trying to set up uh, the VNet that is actually going to be migrated to will have the connectivity to the Active Directory. It's not like we are saying that there's no connectivity at all. So this is we are purely based on purely for testing. Wherever you're testing this, that particular VNet and the subnet associated to that VNet shouldn't be talking to the Active Directory controller, but rest of the stuff, production stuff, can talk to the Active Directory controller. We're not saying just cut off your Active Directory. That's not the point we are trying to make. So when you're doing this testing, you may have to have the local admin credentials. You have to keep, I mean, if you have not touched the local admin credentials for a long time, this is the time before testing to look for what is the local admin username and password for doing this initial testing of this workload in Azure. So.
And that's a really good point. So I'm jumping back a slide now just to keep myself on my toes. I should make it clear that this is an iterative process. So I've had this. So in my lab environment testing things, I've had a server in my existing environment. I've replicated it. I've done a test failover. I think it was a Linux server, and the SSH daemon wasn't running, so I had no way to connect to it. That's fine. I can clean up my test migration. So delete that temporary machine in the sandbox, make a change to the machine in my existing environment, wait for 5 minutes to ensure that the changes I made have been synchronized to the copy that's in Azure, and do another test migration. And then, yeah, brilliant, excellent. SSH is running, but I hadn't changed the firewall, so I wasn't able to connect on port 22. So again, clean up my test migration, delete that temporary machine, make the change on premises, ensure that it's synced, do another test migration. It's absolutely fine. That's kind of the expectation. It's not always the case that you do one test, everything looks fine, then you go ahead and do the migration. It's perfectly fine to do that iterative process and refine what you're doing. So one more just quick thing before we dive into another demo is that we can think about, so we've just been talking about one of them, one of these pre-migration activities. So this idea of testing the workload. So we've enabled replication, and we do a bit of testing to ensure that the machine boots, it's accessible, those kinds of things. That's a really good thing to call out as an activity to complete prior to migration. There are plenty of others though, and this really goes back to what we discussed before with the cloud adoption framework. That's got some great guidance around activities to complete before and after the migration. So we call a few of these out here. So again, as part of the cloud adoption framework, before you migrate anything, you probably want to identify and work with the people who are responsible for that workload. Again, that finance team who have an application made up of a bunch of servers that does something important. Hopefully, you're talking to them before you start moving these servers around. So again, once you've identified that the workload is ready to move, you've worked with that team, you can work with them to understand, when's a convenient time to do that migration, something that works for them. Make sure that they then communicate that this activity, this event is going to happen, and maybe some downtime. You probably want to agree that window for when the workload may be unavailable whilst you do the migration. There are probably going to be some specific tasks that need to be completed for that workload. So again, I talked about maybe there are database connection strings that need to change, or IP addresses will probably change as part of this process. There maybe need to be changes to DNS that have to happen. Again, documenting all of those changes that are specific to an individual workload in a runbook, that's a great idea, so that when it comes to the migration itself, you've got that list of steps you need to complete to ensure that the workload starts correctly once it migrates. And then at the point of migration, once the migration has happened, again, you've got that downtime window where you're doing the work. It's great if you've got, in that period of time, a defined set. You've got that run book that you put together of what you need to do. You know the people who need to connect to the server and verify that it's all working. Not just that it boots and is accessible over RDP to administrators, but also that the application is behaving as it should. So again, having all those people available to do that testing, to verify that it's good, and then being able to make a decision on, do you go ahead? You know, is this server working, this workload, in such a way that we want to commit and go ahead and stick with the servers that are now running in Azure? Do you need to have some kind of rollback process? Maybe you do the migration, you encounter some problems, your change window's closing, you need to go back and revert the work back to the servers on premises. Having a process in place to decide whether or not to do that, again, that's something important to have defined ahead of that activity. Similarly, maybe you're backing the servers up, or maybe you have a monitoring solution that you use in your existing environment. Once those workloads have moved to Azure, that might be the point that you decide, actually, we're going to use an Azure-based monitoring solution or backup solution instead of doing backups back to an on-premises solution. Maybe it makes sense to use something that's in Azure. So again, after migration, those are the sorts of things that you ought to be bearing in mind. And finally, I really like the last point here. When you've completed a migration, it's brilliant if you can to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what you've done, what went well, what didn't go so well, what can you incorporate into your process for future migrations. Because again, it's very rare that customers do a single big bang migration, that they have 500 servers, they enable replication, and one weekend they just move them all across. I don't typically see that. Normally, they break that volume of servers down into smaller groups and enable replication for each group, and go through a process of, okay, we'll move this workload, verify that that goes well, learn any lessons, and incorporate those learnings into their future migrations. So again, I think this is a good starting point for pre and post migration activities to think about. But again, the cloud adoption framework has got some great guidance in this space too. Srini, do you agree that having a set of pre and post migration activities defined is a good idea? And maybe you could show us some of what this looks like in a demo.
Yeah, for sure, right? So we need to have that defined properly. And like Barney mentioned, an important thing, right? So doing a postmortem as well, it's very important because a lot of customers are migrating in different phases or different waves, what we call. When we are doing it in waves, so you may be starting the first wave with some low-hanging fruit, meaning I mean, if you're doing a production server, let's say, I would pick a server that is less disruptive initially. Even if that server goes down, there's no much of a business impact. So that is something. And if you're maybe doing like a environment-based migration initially, maybe doing dev test initially to the Azure first and see how it plays out, and then think about production. That's an approach as well. That's a common approach. So those are the things needs to be considered when migrating, and how you migrate, and the timing of this migration also is very important. So that's my experience and thoughts, Mani.
Brilliant. Maybe we could see some of that in action. I can see you have the portal up here. Maybe we can see what it looks like to do a test migration and then an actual migration.
Yeah, a few minutes ago we saw how to enable a replication, and then when we click on replicating machine, we saw how we see the list of machine that are being replicated, right? So this machine that I enabled replication like maybe 10-15 minutes ago, I guess, it's at 23%, and the other machine, which was at 56%, now it's at 91%. So this replication job is continuous, and so it keeps going on. And let me just walk through like the dashboard for a second before we jump into the test migration and actual cutover. So this is the actual like replicate overview dashboard. You can see the replicate machines and the jobs. And jobs are different jobs. Maybe I would have done a test migration. I would have started a replication. I would have even stopped a replication. All those steps, all those jobs is listed here in the job section. And if there are any events with respect to status changes, right? So maybe I'm unable to reach the appliance and things like that would be listed here. And this is the high level overview of the replicate test migration and migrate screen. And the next step is the test migration. And for doing the test migration, but let's see the dashboard, right? In the dashboard, you see how many test migration is pending, test migration are in progress, and is there any cleanup pending happening? I will talk about that as well. And how many test migrations are done in my case? It is 2. How do you do the testing? Let's go there. And let's pick a machine. And this is the sample database server. And when I get into this machine, when I double click that machine, I see this test migration. When I click on the test migration, it is going to ask me a couple of things, right? So which virtual network? I already selected this virtual network for my testing. But again, it is asking one more time, are you sure you want to still deploy this test machine into this virtual network? At this point, I can choose a different virtual network. There is no choosing a virtual test network or the production network initially when I enable the replication it's not a static variable. You can go back and change those settings. That is what we are trying. I'm trying to emphasize here. And also the subnet, you can change the subnet if needed. And once I click on test migration, and this is what will happen in the background. Until this point, when I started the replication, and the replication job is like doing an initial replication and then the data replication, all those are disk images that are getting saved into the storage account. Until now, there is no like virtual machine that is running in Azure unless and until I click on the test migration button. That is when in the background there will be a process, a hydration process that runs in the background, where it will deploy a machine, and then it will attach the existing disk, the disk image that it's been taking all along. It will attach the latest and greatest image, and it will deploy the virtual machine. That is the process that is going on the background for this particular database server. This is going to take like 10-15 minutes for this to deploy this virtual machine. And I will show you how this will look like, because you don't have to wait 10-15 minutes. I did a test migration for an IIS server. This is how the machine name will look like. The actual machine name is Srini-IIS-server, and it will append an like name along with it saying -test along with it, and it will deploy the test machine. At this point, this is the point where I can log into the machine and do some testing. And you can log in via Bastion, or you can directly log in into RDP. All those things can be done. And this is where we are talking about like the credentials to log in. You should be having all that. If you're not in, if this is not talking to AD, so obviously this testing will not talk to AD. So this is where you have to keep in mind how you're going to test this particular machine. Let me come back to the migrate. And let's go back to different options we have for testing, right? I'm clicking on the replicate machine again. I'm going back to the database server. And right now, since I clicked on the test migration, the cleanup test migration, the migrate, everything is grayed out, because currently the job is running to deploy that machine. So I will not have any other options available. If I go back to another machine, this is an IIS server that I showed you where I clicked on the test migration earlier. This option it gets enabled, which is like cleanup test migration. This is at a point where I'm done all my testing. I'm either happy with the testing, or I'm not like satisfied with the testing because the certain things didn't work out. I have an action plan in place. I'm going to do those action plan, do all those steps to fix that issues, and then come back later and do one more test migration later. That is possible. Or assuming that all my testings went fine in my first go, and then I can do a cleanup test migration, and again, just this is an optional one, like saying testing is complete. And I'm checking this option like testing is complete, deletes this test virtual machine. And when I click on the test, again, a job runs in the background. I deployed a test machine for a different virtual machine. Now I'm cleaning up this test migration for a different virtual machine, which is the IIS. So this will go and delete that virtual machine. Whatever machine I've been testing, it deletes it, right? So this is an important question from customers. So they ask me, like, I have done this testing, in and out testing, let's say. Why do I have to go back and delete this machine and do a cutover? The simple or easy answer, or the easy answer to this is, right, you have done it like a testing with the image of your production machine, right? Let's say I've deployed a test machine today, and you're planning to do a test migration 2 weeks from now. There is a lot of delta replication that happened from now until like the next 2 weeks. The data that is available in this test machine, which is a copy of your current image, right? It's not current anymore because there is in the background there's delta replication happening between source environment to Azure. So that is why we have to clean up this test migration whenever you want to do an actual cutover. At that point, what happens is when I click on, that is where the migrate comes into picture, migrate button, which is grayed out right now because I have to clean up the test migration for the migrate to enable. So when I click on migrate, that is when the machine gets shut down the source environment, and we can take a latest and greatest image of your disk that is available in the source environment and then deploy the machine. Anything to add here, Bonnie?
I just a really quick one is to say that the part of the reason why we do the cleanup is that there are some costs associated with this test migration feature. So from everything we've been explaining, hopefully it's clear that when you hit test migration, a new virtual machine is created in Azure from your data, and that machine is there and running in Azure. You don't get that for free. That virtual machine is running, and it's going to be incurring costs. So factor that into your planning, because you don't want to, have a huge, great big database server that you do a test migration of, and then you just ignore it. You leave it there running for 6 months whilst you kind of plan the rest of your migration, because that machine will be running and incurring costs all that time. So again, generally, I see this test migration feature used as a very temporary thing. On a Monday, you're ready to start doing your testing. You hit test migrate. You connect to that machine, verify that things are working correctly. When you're happy, or when you decide that no, we need to do more changes, you do the cleanup test migration. For me, they're quite short-lived things, these test migrations.
Yeah, that is 100% true, because if you're doing this test migration and you're deployed a test VM, and there's an option in that virtual machine to set up maintenance mode, and where you can select a timeline to shut down the machine. This is with an assumption that you turn down the machine, you forget to shut down, right? So to avoid the cost on that machine, you set up the maintenance mode. Let's say you're going to do only 3 hours or 4 hours of testing, maybe after 4 p.m. Every day. You don't need that machine, then you just shut it down using. We'll shut down it for you based on the maintenance schedule. It goes to power off, and you can power it on another day whenever you're doing the testing. So that is something, the cost. Thanks for bringing that up, Arnie. Cost is an important factor when it comes to using your resources in Azure. It's a OPEX model. You are paying for what you are consuming. So, and some of the options, right, before we actually get into the migrate feature or the cutover, right? So this is what you've seen as far as the options is concerned. It shows you the replication status, the migration status, where it says cleanup is pending, and several options like the replication health, the test migration status, configure if there is any configuration issues, when it last synchronized, and it also shows the storage account where this particular disk image is getting saved initially before we do a test or actual migration, and also the location, all those, the subscription, etc. And one other thing to like mention here is the compute and network and the disk option. Let's say this is a common question that being asked is, right, I have selected a compute and network options, and can I save it later? Can I change it later? Yes, this can be saved. You can come here and change the compute type. You can change the virtual network. You can change the target subnet. Everything can be changed from this screen here. And also the disk type, right? If you're selecting a standard hard disk, and you can go change disk and change it to a SSD if needed. So these are things that's very important to consider if you want to change those options later on after you're doing the initial application. So having said that, right? So let's look at like a use case where, okay, I think this cleanup test migration just completed, which was a great timing. Uh, so next step is the actual migrate here. What happens when I click on migrate? And this is a very important option. It is asking whether to shut down the source machine. So it is asking questions, shut down virtual machine and perform a planned migration with no data loss. This is something we talked about initially in our presentation as well. The question is, where can you have a data loss? It's yes and no. If you're planning it perfectly, then there will be no data loss. Meaning, if I'm shutting down the machine in the source environment and taking a Delta copy of it to Azure, then there's no data loss, assuming that there are no users logging in before the shutdown and things like that, right? So those are the planning part that comes into picture. And once that is done, and there are Delta copy that is getting copied to Azure, and then a new machine will be deployed after this when I click on migrate. So that is where the cutover is happening. And then again, the testing portion comes into picture. Now I mean, you may have to do some pre-migration step, post-migration step after this. But however, like we mentioned, Barney mentioned earlier, there's a lot of there'll be a list of things that you'll be testing in Azure, and also a list of things you'll be doing, some of the steps you'll be doing in Azure, some of the steps you'll be doing in the on-prem environment, such as the DNS changes, depending on where the DNS server is, etc. Anything else to add, Barney, with respect to testing the migration cutover?
I don't think so. No, I think we've pretty much covered everything, haven't we? We've talked about the replication process. We've talked about how you can do test migrations, and we've talked about what the actual migration itself looks like. So no, I think that covers the whole lot, doesn't it? Fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the next step is to talk about our one of the tools that we offer is the migration execution guide. Can you switch to
Exactly.
your screen? Let's switch to your screen and jump into the migration execution guide.
Definitely. Yeah. So I'm aware, and I think we're all aware, that we've talked about quite a lot of different things here. So we've talked about things like planning your waves, how you do the migration, how you identify groups of servers, identifying the stakeholders, the people who are going to be involved in doing the work, like understanding who owns what, the planning process for all of this work as well. Things like we talked about the run book that you might have. So for a particular workload, if there are certain steps that you need to take for that, these are lots of things that you need to think about. And again, a little bit like we've already talked about in other places, you could just start from a blank piece of paper and figure these things out yourself. But through the experiences that colleagues of ours have had and other members of the fast track team, we've been able to put together what we call the Migration Execution Guide. You'll sometimes see it referred to as the MEG, because again, at Microsoft, we run on acronyms, so everything has to be an acronym. But the MEG, or the Migration Execution Guide, is examples, some of these prescriptive guidance and templates, reusable assets that you can use as part of planning your own migration project. So again, rather than having to start from a blank spreadsheet and think about and plan all this from scratch yourself, there are some really, really good starting points that you can use as part of this solution to help with your planning yourselves. Somehow, as well, they've managed to grab a brilliant URL. These aka.ms links are they're usually quite hard to come by, and the team that put this together have managed to grab aka.ms/migrate, which is fantastic. That's it's a bit of a coup for them, I think, to have grabbed that. Srini, have you worked with the MEG much? Is this something that you've helped customers to put together and use?
Yeah, so we have been, I've been talking to some customers about this migration execution guide for customers where they are very new, like you mentioned, and they don't know where to start from, right? How this whole process, like discovery, assessment, the migration tool, and also the planning portion, right? What kind of planning they have to do, and all those things. It's a complete. It's basically a spreadsheet with a lot of tabs. That's how I put it. So in that spreadsheet, there are different tabs which will help you guide through different steps in the migration journey, and which will guide you through on how to like do the planning, how to do the testing, how do you like collect the data, where you store the data. And it's a good tool for almost everybody in the organization, especially it's a good tool for the PMs who run the migration project as well.
Absolutely. I think I've seen in there that there's a Gantt chart, which I know that project managers are always super excited about. Yeah, I find them a little bit intimidating as a lowly engineer. They're a little bit outside my comfort zone, but yeah, absolutely. If you're watching this and you're Gantt chart oriented, check out the Migration Execution Guide. That's got some great resources for you. Great. So with that, I think we can summarize what we've covered today. So we started out by talking about Azure landing zones. So that whole concept of the environment that you're migrating your workloads to in Azure. We shared some resources about how you can, if you're starting from a blank canvas, so a greenfield environment, we can give you some starting points, some reference implementations that you can use. If you have an existing environment, a brownfield environment, we talked about our review checklists that you can use to assess your existing environment and perhaps identify areas where you could improve it. Once we talked about your landing zone, we then went on to talk about replication. So the work you can do to actually start moving data from your existing environment into Azure, ready for the migration. And finally, we talked about how you can test that migration process. So before you just go ahead and jump and push things into Azure, we talked about how you could do some testing beforehand. So verify that when you come to do the migration, things will hopefully move nice and smoothly without any hiccups. So I said at the start that we had several links that we'd refer to throughout the session, and I'm sure you can agree that we've done that. We collected all of those links together in a collection, together with some additional resources that we think will be helpful for anybody who's interested in migrations. That link is on screen now. Again, you have the QR code you can follow as well. I'm sure that link will be in the comments or in the description as well, so it shouldn't be too hard to find if you're watching this session back. And that about wraps things up for today. So we should also call out that there are, this isn't the last Learn Live session. There are more sessions, including another one from some of our colleagues around the well-architected framework. I can see that's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon Australian time. So that's a bit past my bedtime, I think. So I might have to catch the recording of that one. But I'm sure that's some great content. I'll be sure to watch that back afterwards. From my perspective, I want to say, Srini, a huge thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. I've really enjoyed putting these sessions together and presenting them with you. A huge thank you to our moderators as well, Saul and Becky. I haven't been able to keep up with the comments, but I'm sure they've been busy answering questions left and right. And also to Kimberly and everybody else who's off screen helping us put these sessions together. It's been great fun. I really enjoyed it. Srini, I'm sure you've enjoyed yourself too.
Yeah, yes, Bonnie. So same here. I'm echoing the same to you, Bonnie. So it's been good working with you, sharing our experiences, migration experiences, and also our moderators, Saul and Becky, and also our like organizer, Kimberly. So it's been a good session, and hope this has helped everyone understanding the whole migration journey, right, from start to finish, how this whole process works for you. And of course, if somebody will have missed the session, go back. This is a recorded session. Please go ahead and look at this recording and feel free to post any comments, for if you have any questions. And we really appreciate your time in attending this session, and hope this has helped you in the migration, in your migration journey.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, happy migrating. Enjoy the journey moving to Azure.
Yeah.